And I didn't forget to record. All right, take it away, Sad.
Okay, well, thanks for joining, guys. In today's talk, I just wanted to show one of the tools that can be used in the Enclave to write and author code and collaborate with other people on the same code base. Oftentimes, people use Code Workbook, which is generally more adapted for data science type of project. You explore your data, you do some analysis, you run your models, and it's more adapted for quick iterations. But then there is this other tool or app called Code Repositories, which is gives sometimes about the same functionality, but is more adapted for example, writing complex data pipelines and transformations with a lot of dependencies. It allows you to do more things, for example, creating custom libraries. And it generally has a more robust change management system. And I'll show you an example of that. You can do debugging and other things that are less, I guess, important when you work on a code workbook, but when you start managing pipelines from end to end. For example, all the pipelines that create the OMOP tables that you guys are consuming as an input to your studies, these are written in code repositories. So to start, I'm just going to create a code repository and then start showing you some examples of what you can do with it. So you can create it from here, or I'm just going to create one from this folder that I created in the Enclave user group folder. And so I'm just going to click new and pick repository. And so in terms of coding languages, in code repositories, you have mostly 3 options. So you can write code in Python or SQL or Java. Mesa is like an internal code language, which is less used. But these are more, in most cases, you'll be writing code in one of these languages, Python, SQL, or Java. And you can write, obviously, you can have multiple scripts with different languages within the same code repository. So I'm just going to, and here it's just asking you to give the code repository a name. So I'm just going to call it code repository example. And you have a few options here. And these options just help you whenever you select one of them to, it kind of like pre-fills the structure that you need to have in your files, depending on the language that you want to use. Or there are other types which are more related to documentation, Python libraries, some TypeScript functions. I won't be covering that today. But very often what you need is just what we call a data transforms code repository, which basically takes input data sets from the Enclave, and then you can do your transformations on them and produce other outputs. So to start, I'm just going to show an example in SQL. And I'm going to click initialize code repository. And so while it's loading, you can see here the name of my code repository, and it's saved in my Enclave user groups subfolder. And then just for quick orientation, on the left-hand side here, you have all your scripts, all the files that you can define to write code. Right now, there is no file. There's just a README that tells you, that explains, how to write a SQL transform if you create a script. And there are some other options here which we'll explore as we go. But generally speaking, this is where you have all your files that you can browse. And on the middle section here is where you author your code. So to start, I'm just going to create a new script, a SQL script. And let's choose the type SQL transformation. And let me call it something like, let's just call it first SQL transform. And so this will create a, actually I wanted to put it in this folder. So let me move it inside the SQL folder. It's easier to manage. You'll see when we start having multiple languages within the same code repository, this structure helps organizing them. And so the basic structure here is, and the thing that's slightly different with Code Workbook is that you have to refer to the data sets that you want to use with the path that they're in within the enclave. So here it's telling me that this is a very basic skeleton code, and I need to specify the source, the path of the data set that I want to start with. And what this will do is I can write my SQL query here, and the outputs, the results will be saved in this data set that is called first SQL transform within this path. I can obviously change the name of it. So let's just say first SQL example. And to start, maybe what I want to do is maybe let's start with this table concept set member and just run a basic query. So one way to get the path of concept set members, you have a number of helpers here, and one of them is called Foundry Explorer, which lets you explore the files within the system, within the enclave. So I know that concept set member is in the data catalog, and I can go and see there, but I can also just like search by name. And so in the data catalog, in this collection called OMOP code sets, if I click on concept set members, I have a preview here of the data and some like basic search helpers. So I can just type in the column names here and narrow down my view. But more importantly, the left side here, this details section, gives me information such as the location. So this is what I need to refer in order to use the data set in my SQL transform. So I'm just going to copy this location and pass it in here. And it's important that the path is between these back quotes. So let's say I wrote a SQL query here. Let's just keep it basic for now. We're just selecting everything from this table and saving it as this data set. I can now just, let's do a first commit. So what commit does is that it saves your code. And so let's just say, let's just give it a commit message such as first SQL query pull in concept set members table. And we're going to commit. So this.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
While it's going. If you don't commit, but you would like left the page, does it save your code editor for you like all the other tools?
It will save it, but then you will see that this script will be like colored in orange, basically indicating that you haven't committed your changes. And the reason one of the reasons you want to commit your changes is that there's this file change system here where you can look at all the changes that you put within your scripts. And so you can look at the history of your changes. Right now, this is my first version, so I don't see any change. But once I start editing it, you'll see that you'll see the diffs between all my versions, my code versions. So whenever you commit, it creates like a commit ID. and that's like the version of your code. But that's a good question. If you quit, you won't lose your changes if you don't commit. Now, just gonna close this section. And the other thing you can do is you have two options. You can run a preview of the code. So there is preview and there is build. When you run a preview of the code, it will run whatever script you have here, but it will not save the results in this data set. This is just a preview for you to kind of like test how your output looks and if your code is working. And it's generally faster because depending on the data set size, sometimes it runs on a subset of the data. So it's a good way for you to like check your outputs, check your code before building. And now when you're kind of happy with your changes, you can build. It sounds like it's telling me that there is an unsolved error. Oh, I think this is just like hasn't refreshed yet. So when you build the data set, it takes a little bit longer than preview because not only it has to run your query, but it also has to save the results in this data set output that you specified here. So this is a basic example, but are there any questions so far? I was planning on adding a couple of more lines and then showing you things like creating branches and pull requests and change management.
Yeah, I'm just curious, correct me if I'm mistaken, but under the hood, the version control, the repository, this repository is mapped to or based on like GitHub, is GitHub somewhere behind it. And if that's true, then the commit ID that you showed that is assigned, is that the same verbatim ID as you would see as a version ID in GitHub or different?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's not, this tool is not based on GitHub. It's like an interact within the enclave that lets you author files and code and look at the changes and create pull requests and approve within this tool. However, there is a way to push this code into GitHub. I wasn't planning on spending too much time on it, but basically you can, if you click on this clone, you can clone this, whatever files you have in here, all the code, you can clone it locally in your computer. And then from there, you can also make edits and either push back to this code repository or push to GitHub. In other words, you can push and save this code in GitHub, but it's not like, it's not the same system.
And if you save it locally, you can that becomes a Git project that you can control it and you can push back to here.
Yes, absolutely. You can use Git commands to do your changes, and you can push to Git, or you can also push back here to this code repository. So when it runs, first it runs some what we call checks, which are basically just checks to see if you're referring to data sets that exist, if your code doesn't have any like obvious syntax errors, and then it builds the data sets, and you can open it from here and look at the results. It's still kind of running, but while it's running, I just wanted to do some quick other changes just to show you that you can actually write like normal basic SQL here. So maybe what I want to do here is not select everything, but just select a few columns. So I want to select concept set name, concept ID. So the way you refer to your, when you look at the Explorer, you can see the column names here. And so you can know which columns to call in your code. And let's just do concept name. So let's just show 3 columns. So this is going to be from this data set. And maybe I want to just pick the rows for which the concept set is the latest version. So where is most recent version equals true. So let's just run this as a preview. So as you can see, you have 3 columns, and these should only be the latest version of each concept set. So I'm going to, so you can commit the changes and say, select only 3 columns. I'm just making a commit message up. The other thing you can do is when you hit build, it will automatically commit your changes with like a pre-generated message. But right now, when you look at the 5 changes, you can see that there are 2 versions. And when you click on them, you can compare these 2 versions. So this is what your code used to be for this commit, and these are the new changes that you have. So it's useful when to keep track of all the changes that happen to this data set. Now I can't remember if I triggered the build. I'm just going to trigger one. And while this is running, what I can do now is, let's say we're multiple people collaborating on the same code repository. And maybe I don't want to let everyone edit this file without creating some sort of pull request so that I can review the changes and accept the changes and keep track of all these changes. So let's say I'm user number 2 and I go into this this code repository. Right now, the master branch is not locked, so anyone can edit it, but I'll show you later how to lock it. But for now, suppose even if it's not locked, you want to create a new branch and you don't want to touch the master branch yet. The way to do that is create new branch here, and I'm just going to give it a name. So my initials, and let's just call it my test branch. And so now when you do that, you have 2 branches and you're not on the master branch, you're on the test branch. So when you do changes here, so let's say one of the changes I want is to add the code set ID. When I do a change here, if I switch back to master, this change is not captured until I submit the change to master by what we call a pull request. So we're back here. As you can see, this is orange. So this is telling me that I haven't committed my changes. I can actually just build without committing, and this will automatically build my, my results. And what's interesting here is that when you're on a different branch and you run a code, it will create a new version. So the interesting concept here is that it's not only code that have branches, but also data sets. Data sets can have multiple branches and they correspond to the branch that you have in here. And that's true also for code workbook. So when I build a data set here, this will create a new branch of, it will take a few seconds, but you'll see a drop down here to switch back and forth between branches. While this is running, usually it just takes a minute to run. It's interesting that, but anyways, you can see that the check
in the chat if you want to take it while we.
Of course.
Wansuk is curious if if this interface just connects with people more than code workbooks. Is there like compelling reasons to use code workbooks over this if this is what people would prefer?
Yeah, that's one of the main reasons. This does not support R yet, unfortunately. There are other reasons. I think code workbook has, you can do faster iterations. So you have the console, you can execute snippets of codes in there. And for plotting visualizations, when you generate plots, it's easier to view in code workbook. So think of this as a data engineering tool, or say you want to build some like machine learning library. that you want people to use from a code workbook or from other code repositories, and it's a combination of scripts, this could be like a good way to, like a good tool for that. Having said that, people have their preferences, so I encourage you to check out this tool, and it has a debugger, so that helps. You can define unit tests. I wasn't planning on covering that today, but they have some extra features that you don't have in code workbook. You have some documentation, for example, for SQL. If I want to look at the sum functions and how it works, you have things like that. And then one thing that you don't have in code workbook is you can actually execute some like standalone SQL queries in here, which are, yeah, so which is like kind of an additional feature. Does that, yes. Go ahead.
Will you show us how to use, say, this table in a code workbook and in Contour?
The concept set members?
No, the just created.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely. So
use this code. I guess you don't. Yeah. Well, you're creating transforms, so you could even use your transforms in the code. In the code workbook, right?
Yeah, almost. So you have a few things, and hopefully this will answer your question. So in this code repository, you create output tables. These output tables are saved here in this folder or whatever folder you specify. And so then from this table, you can actually open this table in Contour or code workbook and continue your work there. Starting from this table, that's what's generated in another code repository. So this is like create a new code workbook, and this will import the table. Let me just do that real quick. Actually, let me just copy the path. So I can save my code workbook in this folder.
Okay.
And so now I have a code workbook with this table in it. It was still running, so we don't have data yet, but once it finishes, you should see data and you can start analyzing your table here. You can also do that in Contour. So if you open the table, you can either do open Contour from the click right, or you can just hit. It's interesting. I'm just going to stop my, say that again.
Are you at all disturbed at how slow this is going?
I'm surprised because I did this, I ran this right before the presentation and it took 55 seconds. So I'm just going to cancel and run.
Well, that's even a long time, isn't it?
Well, when you run the preview, it's almost instantaneous, but you're writing the data set, that adds a little bit of overhead. And if you're writing 6 million rows, yes, it's a little slow, but you're not just reading a data set, you're saving it into multiple partitions. And the reason, and it saves you some time when you're starting another transformation from that output data set. Because the output data set is saved into multiple partitions, you can read it quicker.
Okay.
I'm going to just go back here, cancel my build.
Saad,
Yes.
what flavor of SQL was that? Was that
good question? It's Spark SQL, which has some differences, but not that much with Postgres SQL. In fact, since you asked this question, let me show you where to find these differences. So in the, if you go to the homepage, on the training materials, there are a few things here. One is the training portal. And this is the platform documentation. So this is more detailed and talks about each tool. So you have code workbook documentation and you have code repository. And so here, and I'll send you this link, but you have a Spark SQL reference, so you can look at the syntax, but it's almost very similar, and the differences are in this page here. So you have a few differences, syntax differences. So let me send that on the chat, so that if you want to use SQL, you can refer to this.
Thank
But
you.
you can use all of the Postgres functions, or was that like you can use arrays inside queries and stuff like that?
I believe so. I believe you can use arrays. I haven't used SQL that much, but I think you can use most of the stuff from PostgreSQL. The constraints you have is obviously you want to return a data set or a data frame if you're saving your outputs. Let's just. So
Right.
this is the master branch. Sorry, go ahead.
Postgres also has data sets, or Postgres SQL can return data types that are complex data types like JSON and arrays.
Yeah. So I think you can return data types that are not data sets. However, you won't be able to see them in like the viewer here.
Those would be, by data set in this case. So from Postgres's point of view, that would be a data set. You have like rows and columns, but some of the columns have lists inside the column. And you're saying
that's possible. You can have these are columns which are of type array or struct. You can definitely have that in here. I think I just kicked off another build, so let's see how long it takes. I think maybe I just kicked off multiple builds at the same time, and I got it confused. But going back to the code repository, sorry. So let's say I made some changes here in this branch, and I want to submit my changes to the master branch. I will just click on propose changes, and then just describe the changes that I made. So something that makes it easier for others to monitor my changes and accept them. So added colon code set ID. And once I do that, I can create a pull request. And I haven't configured the, so this is like the view of the pull request. I haven't configured my repository to require approvals, which means I can actually approve my changes. I can look at my changes here, maybe make comments, start a conversation. Maybe on the changes, I can say something like, add a comment here. Something like that, and kind of like tag the person who created this pull request. And then once I'm happy with it, I can just merge. And once I merge it, this will reflect on my master branch. So now if I go to, and I have the option to delete my branch or not, let me actually just keep it. And if I switch now to master, you can see that the changes are reflected to master. Now, so if I rebuild the data set, this will take into account these changes. So now I just wanted to show you how to lock the master branch. So if you go to setting, and there is a branches section here, you can choose to protect the master branch. So what this does is that people cannot make edits to the master branch, and it will require approval, or it will just at least require a pull request. And here you have options. So for example, you can require approval for any of or all of the following persons, and I can just choose myself for now as an approver. I can allow the users to approve their own pull requests or not. It's kind of like highly configurable. But now when I do that and I switch to my code, you can see that I just wanted to add a space here, and it's telling me that this branch is locked and I cannot make edits. So I kind of have to either create a new branch or use my existing branch to make some changes and submit them to master. So there's just one way to kind of like organize your work and collaborate with other people. So I'm just gonna make a one like last change and submit it. So for example, let's just rename concept set name to code set name. And I can choose to commit. And let's preview my changes. Yeah, and now so I can see the changes reflected here, and let's just propose these changes to master. So let's say I renamed column concept set name, and we're going to create a pull request.
And how do we look at old versions of, say, the master branch?
So if you go to code, let's say you want to look at versions of the file.
Yeah.
So these are all the versions of this file as you, oops, sorry, I clicked on the link, it shouldn't have. But these are all the versions, so you can compare them. So this is my first version, and then I added these 3 columns. And then.
And how about how do we see old versions of the data?
There are a few ways you can do that. So let me show you the way I like. I'm just gonna take this concept set member as example. There are a few ways. The first one is contour. So if you analyze the data in contour, so this is master as of this date. You can choose to just look at previous versions of the data. So like this version on the 17th of August. And if you hit apply, the data you'll see here is as of this date. And it's automatically telling you this is not the newest version. So if you want to update, you can update. You can also choose a different branch, so not necessarily the master branch. So if I, maybe this branch doesn't have anything, not sure which one is more relevant, but let me try this one. Failed to change.
And can you
said it. I'm sorry.
Can you see a diff between 2 versions?
Yes, that was my other. So one way you can do it is you can create another path here and then have the master branch version of it and then a third path where you do the diff. Or you can do it, there's this compare tab here where you can compare different data sets. So either the same or something different. So let's just pick the same data sets. And maybe I want to compare the 2 data sets, but this one as of this version. And so you have a comparison of the metadata. Obviously, if the data set is very big, it's very hard to see the diff for each row, but this gives you a preview. And you have a diff, if the code changes, you would see the diff here. So you can do that for the same data set, different times or different versions, the different branches, or even different data sets with hopefully the same schema. Otherwise, it won't mean much. So those are some of the few ways you can do a diff. You can also do it in contour. So going back here, and let's go back to my I can't remember if I also, so this is where you see your code here. These are all the different branches that you have, so you can manage them, delete branches. These are all the pull requests, either open or closed. So this one is still open. And if I open it, this will tell me, I can see here the file changes. And this time I'm required to approve to be able to merge. So I'm going to approve or reject. And once that's the case, so let's see, it's requiring approval. Required. It just probably needs a refresh so I can merge the changes. It sounds like there are merging conflicts. I may have accidentally edited the master branch, but there is a mechanism to resolve conflicts if there are any. So right now, if I look at my pull request, so I think the conflict was that I didn't pull the latest from master before editing the branch. And so right now I just did that change and I'm waiting for the checks to run. And when they run successfully, I'll be able to merge. And the checks are just checking, for example, that the data set exists, that you don't have any obvious syntax error. You can actually look at them here. So these are all the checks. Every time you create a commit, you'll see like all the checks here running. So this just ran and I think it just succeeded. So let's just give it a few seconds. And now the check passed. And interestingly,
it's like it's complaining about a warning there. So.
The warning is not really preventing you from merging. The warning is basically, it's telling you, you haven't really built your changes in this branch before merging, so be careful. But it shouldn't prevent you from merging. So I'm guessing something in the settings makes it. Let me check real quick. I may have forgotten to put an approver here. Maybe let's just do that. Require at least one approver before merging. I'll move on if I don't figure it out, but that's basically the idea. I think now I'm able to merge.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah. So if when you initialize your initialized it for language, you picked SQL. Hypothetically, if I can ask my question better, if you pick Java, that's why I say that. But I'm curious what kind of debugging capabilities, like can you set breakpoints, step to the code, like Eclipse?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think debugging works for SQL. I've never used that, but I can show you an example with Python. So one way to do that is let's actually unlock the master branch for now so that I can go quicker. And I'm just going to show you an example in Python. So right now I only have SQL transforms, but I could add a project, which could be like a Python project or a Java project. I'm picking Python because I'm most familiar with, but this should apply to Java as well. So let's just call this Python projects. Interestingly, it took 1 minute, 39 seconds to build. Yeah, so right now what you see is, I'm sorry for refreshing. I created a Python project, so I have this new folder, which is basically everything needed to run Python code. So we have some sort of configuration file here, but usually your code is under this folder, source folder. And you can see examples here. So automatically it shows you examples on how to run transformations in Python. This is like a utility file, so you can define your utility functions here. And here it's kind of the same idea. You have, let's just make this uncommented. And basically, this is how you specify your input. You specify the path here. So it could be one or multiple inputs. And then you specify your output here, which could also be multiple outputs. And then once you do that, you have this main Python function that takes in your input. And then you can do here, write your Python code and return a data frame output. So just as an example, I'm going to take actually the output of my SQL query and make it the input of my Python transformation. So I'll go back to, let me actually rename examples. So I'm going to rename the file something like Python example transformation.
I've seen in code workbooks sometimes it says that a transform is a write back transform. Is that what
I think what you a write back transform is when you, it's like a different concept. When you have a data set modeled as an object, you can actually write back, that data set is saved in phonograph, and you can write back to phonograph and make edits on it. That's what it should be about. So let me add my input in here, my path, first SQL example. And let's just call, let's just put our output here and let's call it Python output. Let's just call this something maybe more interesting than let's just call it SQL input. And this is what is going to go in my main function, which could be called my compute function or something else. And let's just do some basic transformations. So for example, I'm going to define an output data frame, and which is just maybe selecting a couple of rows, a couple of columns from this output. So this is my output. Let's just select these two, concept ID and concept name. And maybe let's just rename one of the columns. Let's rename concept ID to ID. This is just a basic, let me actually do it on a second line here, just to show you how we can go through the code and debug. So basically I took my data set, which is now a Python data frame as an input. I'm making some basic transformations, selecting two columns, renaming a column, and then this is what I'm going to be returning as my output data frame. It's kind of like warning me that I'm not using anything from my utilities, but it's not really an error. So I'm just going to comment this out for now. And let's first commit this and run it as a preview. And then I'm going to create a breakpoint and go through the code. So it's already automatically committed my file. if I run preview, so there, it sounds like there is a code assist error. So I might have some syntax error somewhere. So let's try this. And so while it's running, I just wanted to show you, like, you can refer to other files, other scripts within your transformation script. So if I define something here, like a rename colon function, which takes a data frame and then a column name and a new name, and then just renames that column. So we're going to do return df that with column rename. This is PySpark syntax, but you can also do it in pandas. So I'm just going to rename column name to new name. And now that I'm doing that, I can go back to here and call this function. So instead of doing the rename, so you can see here, this code worked. But now let me just write it differently. So now I'm going to use my functions in util, which is called rename column. And it takes a data frame, which is my output df, and then an old name and a new name. So I'm just going to do it like that. This is obviously not super realistic because it's very easy to rename columns, but I just wanted to show you how to refer to scripts that are outside of your main script. And this applies to actually custom Python libraries, which I'll touch base on a bit if we have time. So let's just commit this, and I'm just gonna say dummy message. And then let's put a breakpoint. So you can see here that you can also kind of like analyze your outputs, just like in the dataset preview, and look at the results. Now, if I put a breakpoint here, and now instead of preview, it says preview and debug. And so now the code stopped here, and I have these two variables, which I can explore here and look at their values. So for example, these are the columns of my output data frame. And yeah, I think I can execute code here. So like I can do something like check the number of rows of my data frame at that stage in line 12. So if I do something like that count, I think it will give me the count of my data set, of my data frame. So meaning that you can set up breakpoints, you can explore variables here. Sometimes if they're data frames and you click on them, you will see a preview of the data sets in here. So like this is a preview of the debugger at this stage. This is what this data set looks like. Does that answer your question, Armin, about like debugging, setting up breakpoints?
Yeah, that's really cool. I don't think you can do that in the workbook. So when you call that function from utils, so you obviously, it gave you project scope.
Mm-hmm.
Can you cross project scopes? What's scoping like? Can you like, because you have two projects, right? Could you have called something from the scope of the other project?
That's a very good question, because that's actually what I wanted to talk about now, which is basically, so there are a few things you can do. You can obviously call libraries, which are like open source libraries, Python or others, and use them within your workbook. And I'll show you how to specify that. But the other thing which is interesting that you can do is you can define your own custom Python library within a code repository. and you can call it from another code repository or even from code workbook. And I don't have time to go through the whole process right now, so I'm just going to show you an existing one. In fact, the way to do it, let's say you want to create a custom Python library. When you try to create a repository, instead of choosing data transform, you can choose Python library and then give it a name, maybe something like lib example enclave user groups. And this kind of gives you the skeleton and the instructions to create your own custom library. So it could be useful for people who develop ML packages inside the enclave and they want other users to use them. So it just kind of like creates a skeleton which is slightly different. And in fact, I have another repository open in which I can show you how it looks like, just because we're running out of time.
Would folks, since I'm sort of cognizant that we're about 4 or 5 minutes from the top of the hour, would folks be interested in another full discussion about writing libraries? I don't know, Saad, if there's a whole discussion there to be had.
Yeah,
Yes.
That's a good question. Sorry.
We got some
Yeah, I
things-
think it would be worth spending more time on that.
Absolutely. I'm happy to cover more content within the next session. So there are other things I wanted to mention about the features that we didn't have time to cover today. But just to show you briefly how it looks like, suppose you created a library code repository and then you define a set of functions here. Obviously, these are very basic. And then you call the folder example package. I'll show you a repository from which we're using this library. I've created this example, I think, during one of the first ML hackathons. So this is now a transforms code repository. And basically, I'm importing this example package, which is this folder here. And I'm using the myutils functions, which are basically the name of the script. And now I can call the functions, I just renamed it, but I can call the functions that I defined in this package in my custom library here. Now, in order to be able to import this custom library, ML custom lib, which has this package in another repository, there is a libraries section here, and then you can look for it here. So if I do ML custom lib example, and I click on it, you can see that it's already added, but I can also try to add other open source libraries. I'm just thinking of this Lifeline Python package. I can add it to my repository. So once I add it, I can refer to it, import it in my scripts. And the same is true when you define a custom library, you can actually call it from a code repository. In fact, if you look at customize environment and do customize package, I think if I start typing ML, what is it called? Yeah, ML custom lib example, I can actually use the library that I defined within my code repository. So I'm happy to spend more time on that next week, as well as other features of code repository. I realized it was hard to fit everything in one session, but I'm happy to stop here and answer any questions.
So that was awesome. I have a question about the, I guess it's, if a transformation or a set of transformations is written in R, so we might have to start from a code notebook or something, but how would we templatize that into, can we even do that in the code repository?
If you write any transformations in code workbook, whether it's R or any other language, you can make them as templates, as code workbook templates. Okay. So it's a different process. I can send you the doc, but basically these are templates that are only usable from other code workbooks. So if I open my code workbook, instead of creating a new transformation, I can choose to import your template and run it with some inputs. So that's like one way to do that within code workbook.
Okay.
So to share our code, the only way right now is to create code workbook templates. Any other questions?
I have one, but maybe I'll wait. Maybe I'll just say we'll save it for the next iteration of this one. I think there's lots of people who want to see more, so we'll definitely schedule another kind of the code repository session.
Yeah, no
The
problem.
week after next, I think we have Jared up next week to talk about one of the code workbook templates that he developed.
Yeah, no problem. And again, feel free to reach out if you have questions. And in the platform documentations, you can also look at some quick starts tutorials if you want to get familiar with the tools. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Have a good weekend.
Thanks.